Hello, everyone. My name's Chris Bria. I work in local assistance and market development at CalRecycle. You may remember me from every one of the previous one of these webinars for the past however many years. Welcome once again if you're a experienced reporter, and if you're a new reporter, welcome for the first time. Today we're going to be going over the electronic annual report. A couple notes you'll see on the screen. Please use the Q&A to ask questions. We won't necessarily be monitoring the chat. If we need to unmute you so you can ask your question directly, we will ask you to unmute. And also a new note per department policy, AI chatbots and note takers are not allowed as a participant. So if we see any of those pop up in the participant list, we will be removing them. So just a heads up if you were going to rely on that for notes. But also, the best part about this webinar is it's also going to be recorded and posted on our website, and we will try to get that out as fast as we can in the next few days. So, next up, we will have a couple of guest speakers. We'll have Adrian Saliot, who's going to discuss some of the new aspects of the year, as well as a few other of the 1383 sections. And we also have Peter Stacklis from our knowledge integration section to discuss RDRS reports and RDRS data. So back to the screen. Oh, again? Okay. Let's hold on that for a minute. So from our webpage on LG Central, you can get to that from the homepage going to government and local coordinators. And that'll take you to the LG Central homepage. And from there, if you go to the data reports button, there's access to various other data reports based on the year and for disposal reports and additional calculators that are available on the website. And if you go to the first link here on the year, it'll take you to this annual report homepage. From here, you can access RDRS reports, additional information about SB 1383 reporting, and for any of our newer reporters who have not completed one of these before, you can access the previous webinars on this subject from the past few years. As we go through the year this time, we are not going to be filling out every single section and dealing with every single field that needs to be filled out. It would take far too long, and we would rather spend time answering any other questions you may have on the new items or perhaps some specific items to your jurisdiction if we can. So if you want to get a full readout from the previous years, this would be the page to do it from. Okay. Next up. If you are a new reporter and are not a previous user, this logic page here can be very helpful. If you are a new reporter and have never filled out a year before and you're not in the system, you would want to fill out a reporting change contact request form and get added to the system. When you are added there, it will send you an invite to create a web pass if you don't already have one. If you already have a web pass, it should send you a note saying you've been granted access to Logic. So it doesn't really matter which one you do first, but if you have a web pass first, you don't have to respond to the invite that it sends and go through that process. So when you want to log into the ear, also I will mention that when we're logging in from here, there is a login on the annual report page, as well as this one. Might as well just use that for the Logic system sign-in. So when you log in, you'll see a screen that looks like this. For purposes of the webinar today, we are going to be using our staging system. So the data in here, some of it's real, some of it's testing, but Nothing's going to affect the actual annual reports. And when we're showing some examples, don't worry. If yours is up on the screen, we're not actually changing anything specific to yours. So once you log into the system, because we're admins on the system, we have a list of multiple jurisdictions available. You will only see the ones that you have access to. And for the purposes of today's demonstration, we are going to be using Yuba Sutter because they have a number of pieces that we do need to cover. So when you log into here, this will be your home page, and you should see latest ear cycle due. If you want to access previous PDF summaries from the previous ears, they're right here. Same thing with report venues or venue summary reports. If you haven't reported on those in the past, you won't have that option. And also, if you want to download a full set of your previous diversion program notes, you can access that from here. When you log into the ear, different jurisdiction types will see different tabs and different pieces. The special collection districts will have a different setup than the incorporated cities, which have a different setup than the unincorporated counties and the regional agencies. There's a bit of helpful info on this front page, including in this latest news box over here, though some of this news is repeated from previous years. We just want to keep it front of mind. Also, if you need additional help, you can download the external guide here. It's in a convenient PDF that is bookmarked, and you can jump to certain sections. And this is pretty much the same as it's been in previous years, but in the procurement section, we did update a couple of the screenshots as well as the updated, where'd it go? The updated procurement information and the calculation factors for them if you want to do some of your own math at some point. So with that, I will check for some questions in the Q&A if there is anything specific to this, and nothing yet. Okay. So yeah, if you have questions on that come up later, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we can come back to it at the end of the chat, or we might be able to just answer the question directly in the chat. Okay, and with that, I would like to turn it over to our friend Peter Stackless, who's going to review the RDRS reports with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Stackless. I'm the project lead that oversees the RDRS system. That's the recycling and disposal and reporting system. So that's basically the system where facilities, landfills, transfer stations, we call them transfer processors, contract haulers, different facilities report their disposal or their green material ADC, and then eventually those tons get moved into the ear and show up on the calculator page for each jurisdiction because those facilities are reporting on the tons that, allocation related to the jurisdictions that sent those tons. So I'm going to try to show you the reports on the web, that CalRecycle website, that can kind of help you look at that data. So let me share my screen and show you the web page. Do you see the CalRecycle web page?
No, you're not sharing it.
I'm not sharing.
Gotta
Let me
press that
open.
extra blue button at the
Oh,
bottom.
okay.
Yeah,
Pardon
yeah.
me. Okay, now do you see it?
Uh, yes, we see the homepage. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. So Chris mentioned that, so we have a bunch of reports for RDRS data, not just for jurisdiction data. And they mentioned that there's a link on the ear, but if you needed to get to it from CalRecycle's page, the best way to do it is just to kind of search for it because there's a lot of different topics on the page and you can get lost just kind of searching it. So I would just search for RDRS in this search box. And the first result that should come up is the main page that stores all the information related to RDRS, for reporters, people who use the system, but also has a link to the reports. So if you look at it, you have these boxes here on the top, and to get to the RDRS public reports, you click on this big one on the right. Okay, so this is the main page that has all the RDRS reports. So we have about 12 or 13, 12 of them. The key thing to remember about the data is, and this is important because the ear data for their disposal and the data that gets shown in the calculator is static. It's what was moved over around June 14th. But entities, reporters in the system can change their data at any time. So the data in these reports may be newer or may be different because entities can change their data. And so this data is updated nightly for all these reports. So if you see something, you come back like a week later, it could be because people have added data. So the two main reports for looking at jurisdiction data is the first one here, overall jurisdiction tons for disposal and disposal related uses, and then the second one, which I'll go over. Okay, so this is the best report for seeing a jurisdiction's tonnage for the whole year for landfill tons, transformation tons, engineered municipal solid waste tons, and then green material ADC. So all these reports kind of have a description at the top. It's just kind of telling you in general what the report is about. So feel free to look at that if you need to. And there's always a link to the older data from EDRS, which was prior to 2020. If you need to look at that data, there's a link there to get to those reports. So the data is in RDS was reported at a quarterly level, but the data in the ear is at a yearly level. So you'll likely want to see it in the yearly sum option, which we have both options here. So I'll show you the yearly sum first, but if you need to, you can see it as it's reported at the quarterly level. So you pick that radio button and pick the year. So we want to look at 25 since that's what we are focusing on for 2025 data. If you pick the yearly sum option, you don't have to pick any quarters here because it's blanked out. But if you pick the quarterly sum, then you could pick a quarter if you wish. Material type basically lets you look at the data that's landfilled, means sent to landfills in state or exported out of state. Data sent to transformation facilities. We only have 2 of those remaining, and then they're pretty much not operating anymore. But if you're looking at past data, you can filter it by that. And then the EMSW conversion facilities, we have 1 of those. But I would recommend just keeping it on all. That way you can see all the data all at once. And then you can filter the data by statewide if you want to see all jurisdictions that report for the year you selected for 25. You can do it by county. So it'll bring up a county dropdown. You can pick the county and it'll show all the jurisdictions in that county. And then you can do it by individual jurisdiction. So I'll do it by individual jurisdiction. And I'm not picking on, I'm going to pick LARA, Los Angeles Regional Agency, only because it has a lot of data. But I'm not picking on them if you're part of that jurisdiction. So if you hit search, then it should show the results. So it will basically show you the year, jurisdiction, the county they're in. And there's a bunch of other columns of data here. But the key ones to focus on are these 3 here: landfill, including hosted signed tons due to missing reports, transformation, and then the same, and EMSW. And even then, landfill is the main one to focus on, because for transformation, we only had 0.1 tons reported in 2025 due to the facilities basically closing down. And for EMSW, we only have 1 active reporter, and they didn't report any data for 2025. So just as a note, you can kind of ignore those for 25 data, but for prior years, for transformation, you would have more tons. So what this landfill column would show you is all the tons that were sent to by your jurisdiction that you selected to landfills in California or exported out of state to landfills or transfer stations out of state or out of country. So you can see there's 4 million plus tons. Okay, so there's some other helpful columns here, and the other major point that you see in your calculator is green material ADC, since it started to count as disposal in 2020. So that is shown here too. And they had 0 tons, but some people have tons. And then we get the columns that kind of focus on host assigned. So this can be confusing because it's kind of a term that we came up with. It basically only means that, so the RDR system looks at tonnage sent upstream from transfer stations, transfer processors, eventually to a landfill or exported out of state. So if one of those upstream facilities sent tons to, say, a receiving facility like a landfill, or the landfill reported that they received tons from an upstream transfer station, but there's no data, there's no quarterly report in the system. Well, then we've made it so that the system automatically host assigns those tons to that upstream transfer station, the jurisdiction they reside in. So say if it was like a facility, then it would be host assigned to them, or if it's a contract hauler, it's a host assigned to wherever they are in. So it can be confusing. We only have about 600,000 tons out of the 37 million plus that are host assigned. So there's not that many, but that's what these columns kind of mean. So for like landfill tons, here's how many that were host assigned for this jurisdiction. And then same thing for transformation and EMSW. And that sums it up so you can see the total amounts for those three. And then further right here, if you're interested in exported tons, you can see the green material ADC sent out. Well, that's the host assigned tons. So you can see that for green material ADC also. But for exported, you can see the exported green material sent out of state, and then the ones that were host assigned. And then the new addition for this year is mixed plastic waste export tons. So with AB 881 facilities in RDRS, these are transfer processors, recycler composters, broker transporters. They had to start reporting any kind of plastic sent to disposal out of country. And so out of country means any country besides Mexico and Canada, because we already have treaties with them, so they weren't included in the counting. And so if it's sent to Mexico or Canada, it doesn't count. They don't have to report on it. But basically what's reported on is they report on the materials they send to out of country, and then for the origin, they report on the jurisdiction allocation for it for the total tons they send out, not by each material. So you'll see that here that there's 3,000 tons. There's not that many yet. I believe there's only like 9,000 tons reported for the whole year, but this will be a new item you want to check because I believe it's going to be in your ear calculator as a line item. So that's pretty much it for this report. If you ever have issues with it, a good way to kind of start over is to hit the reset button. And that will clear everything, clear your output, clear all the filters, and you can start over and select what you want for the report again. So if you ever need to go back to the main reports page, there's these little links up at the top, and that's kind of a quick way to get back. You can also use your browser button with the back function, but I always tend to use these because they seem more dependable. So the second report that could give you more detail on jurisdiction disposal is the second one, jurisdiction disposal and beneficial reuse by destination. And that report's kind of showing exactly what it says. It's instead of showing the overall tons that a jurisdiction sent for a year or for a quarter, it's showing it by destination. It takes a second to load here because sometimes these reports are a little slow. Okay, so it's the same type of interface, and you have the text again at the top describing the report a bit. So you can look at the data at the quarterly sum level or the yearly sum level. For this report, it's probably better to kind of look at the quarterly sum level of looking at it because the data is reported quarterly by facilities. And so to kind of get an idea of where your jurisdiction tons go, you'd want to see it by quarter. But you can also do it by yearly sum, which would just sum it up for the sum of all those tons sent to a facility. So initially I'll do it for quarterly sum and pick 25. And then again for quarters, if you leave these all blank, then it'll show you all four. But if you click an individual one, then it'll just show you that quarter. So I'll just show quarter 4 for 25. Again, for material type, it's the same options as in the prior report. I'd leave it as all so you could see everything, but you can filter it if you wish. And then for the disposal facility name or RDRS ID. So what this does is like if you know where your jurisdiction is sending tons to in terms of a final landfill or a facility out of state, you could pick it, or you could just leave it blank and then it'll show you all the facilities that your jurisdiction sent tons to. So My recommendation would be to leave it blank unless you know you want to look at a specific facility that you know got tons from your jurisdiction. And then for jurisdiction, it'll show the whole list of jurisdictions for 2025. If you left it blank, you could see all of them, but I'll pick the same layer again that I picked before just to make it easier and focus on one jurisdiction. And so if you hit the search button, again, it may take a bit sometimes. There you go. So what it does is show you all the facilities in terms of landfills in state or landfills or transfer stations out of state that receive tonnage for that LARA sent tonnage to for the different fields. And again, those fields are the same. So again, on the left here, you'd see the year, the quarter, the destination facility that received the tons, the jurisdiction that you're looking at, the county they're in. And then this is kind of new. You can see whether it's exported or not. So no means it's in state. Yes, it means it was sent out of state. And then you have the same three fields that were in the other report, the landfill total tons, the transformation total tons that LARA sent to to the facilities listed, and then the EMSW tons. So again, the main focus here should be just landfill for 25 because we don't really have tons reported for transformation and EMSW. And again, similar to the other report, you have the host assigned fields that'll show you if any of these tons for landfill, transformation, EMSW, and green material ADC were host assigned. So I forgot, yeah, you can also see the green material ADC tons sent to these facilities by LARA or Los Angeles Regional Agency. And so it'll give you a sum of the total host assigned tons as the other report does. And then you can see the exported tons sent out of state for green material, and then the host assigned tons. And this report doesn't include mixed plastic waste export because it's just showing you the destination. So that doesn't really work because it's reported at the country level. So we didn't include it in this report. So I wouldn't look at trying to see your mixed plastic waste export tons in this report because it doesn't kind of match the output. And then for these reports, both of them, the ones I showed you, if you want to see totals, you'd want to go to the bottom of the screen and it'll show you the totals for each column. And then to move through the reports, if there's more than items listed or shown on your screen, you can use these arrows to go to the next group of records. And then it can also take you to the last one if you hit this double arrow at the end. And at any time when you're running the report, if you see this, the blue kind of bar means that it's working. So if you'll see the screen kind of get lighter and then see that blue bar, that means it's thinking and outputting. And then once it's off, then you've done, the results have shown. Again, you got the reset button. So if you need to reset anything in the report, you can do that with the reset button and start over. And then on any of these reports, you can export them to an Excel file and it'll show the output of that data for whatever you ran in the report. So it's kind of a handy function if you want to see the data in Excel. Okay, so going back to reports. So those are the two main reports I think that are best for looking at your overall jurisdiction disposal and green material ADC data. That we have two others. The fifth report here, jurisdiction disposal exported out of state by destination, just kind of like focuses on showing you only export if you're interested in looking at that. And then the sixth one here, number 6, total jurisdiction disposal or disposal related materials sent through transfer processors versus directly to a landfill, kind of shows you the tonnages that are accepted by a transfer station or a transfer processor and then eventually sent to a landfill. So if you want to get into that detail, you can use this report. Fortunately, we don't have the time for me to show you those two reports because it would take too long. But you could look at those two reports and see that data if you need to. Okay, so that's jurisdiction data. I also wanted to give you an idea of how to look at the entities that report in RDRS if you need to, and then also look at their quarterly reports if you want to see if they've submitted one, not the actual data, but whether they've submitted their quarterly report that has the data that may have the disposal you're interested in. So report 0 here is the best way to kind of see all the entities that report in RDRS. So this includes the registered ones that report in California, or the broker transporters and contract haulers that could be out of state. And it also includes facilities that are in the system because they don't report, but they could be like facilities out of state, like a landfill in Nevada or a landfill in Oregon, because we need to have them in the system so that people can report that they sent material to them. So basically the whole, all facilities and entities in RDRS are in this report. So initially when you run it, it'll show you all of them here at the bottom. You can scroll through and look at them all if you wish. But the best way is to kind of like figure out, look for ones that you want to look at. So if you know their name, you could start typing here in the reporting entity activity or RDRS ID field. And as you type, it'll look through the whole list of facilities in that dropdown and bring up anything related to what you type. So here I typed in Fremont, so you can see there's 2 facilities with Fremont in the name. And then just for those that don't know, the RDRS ID is a way for that entities are ID'd in the system. They each have a unique ID, and so that's what the RDRS ID is. So if you know that, you could type that in too. So you can see here RD10084 is the one for BLT Enterprises of Fremont. Another way you could also look at it by landfill or recycler or transfer processor, the activity type that reports in RDRS, to narrow it down. If you know their site name, it may be different than the reporting entity name, so you can enter that here. Reporting status, that shows whether they're exempt or required. Exempt meaning they don't have to report per the requirements in AB 901 and reporting in RDRS. And then the registration status, active or inactive, would show facilities that are inactive or not operating, but they're still required to report. And then active mean obviously they're operating and have to report in RDRS. And then you have a bunch of fields here that can let you filter it by the address of the site that the entity resides on. So the information that you get here is you get the RDRS ID, the site and entity name, the activity type that they are, the registration status, whether they're operating or not, the reporting status, so whether they're exempt or not. Required means they have to report and they're submitting reports in the system. The starting reporting period, what that means is that's when they started submitting quarterly reports in the system. Because sometimes entities start later, so they could have started in 24 or 25, so it would show that quarter then in this column. And then you get the jurisdiction that facility or that entity is based in. So the system looks at it and looks geographically at where they're located and then assigns a jurisdiction to them. And then you get all the address info if you need to look at that. And phone number, that's the general phone number that the entity gave. So if you need to contact them. Provisional entity, yes, no, basically means provisional is like a facility that's out of state that doesn't report, or an exempt facility that hasn't logged into our system and doesn't report. So if you see yes for that, that's what that means. No means that they're a registered facility and they have to report in RDRS unless they're exempt. And then is dependent, kind of going into the weeds here, it basically means the law allows like certain facilities to have another registered facility report for them in quarterly reports. And if that's yes, then that's what that means, that somebody else that's registered in RDRS is reporting for them. And then we have the Swiss number if you need to see that. And again, you got the reset button here that'll reset the report if you need to start over again, clear the data. Okay, so moving right along. So if you needed to see a quarterly report from one of these facilities that you looked up, you want to go to Report 10, Quarterly Report Search. And what this report does is kind of, if you pick a entity in the system, and I'll choose Fremont as an example since I picked it on the other one, it'll show all their quarterly reports and the status of the quarterly report. So I'll pick I guess Fremont Recycling, I think that's the one I already picked, but either way. And again, you can filter this by different things. You can say if you're interested in just a certain reporting period, like the more recent ones, you could pick those for the facility. You could also filter it by the status of the quarterly report. So if you wanted to just see the not submitted ones, you could do that. But for most of these reports, if you leave it blank, then it'll show all the options. And then there's some other ones you can filter it by the entity type, activity type, and when they submitted it. But I'll just run it. Okay, so what's this will show is all the quarterly reports that Fremont Recycling and Transfer Station is required to submit in RDRS. So it'll show their basic information of the facility, their registration status, the reporting status, and then you get the reporting period. So that's kind of where you want to start looking at it and seeing, okay, well, let me sort it. And another thing, you can sort these columns by newest to oldest just by clicking on the column header. So that's kind of a useful feature. So looking for 26 Q1, the quarterly report status will show whether they submitted it. So submitted means that's their initial quarterly report that they're required to submit. Revised means they already submitted an initial one and then they revised it and then submitted it again. And then not submitted would mean they haven't submitted their quarterly report. And then there's a quarterly report exemption type field. Basically, that means entities can submit a quarterly report and say I was exempt for that quarter. So if you see a reason here, that means they submitted the report as exempt and then didn't submit any data. And then you just get the quarterly report due date. That was when they were required to submit that report for that quarter. When they submitted the report initially for the first report. And then you have some fields showing you if they submitted a revision, the last time they revised it, and then the total amount of revisions they have. So you could see like if it's 2, that means they have a initial report and then 2 other revisions that they did. So yeah, it can be handy if you need to see if a entity submitted a quarterly report or a reporting period that you're interested in. Okay, so the last but not least is to show you the complaints tool. So the complaints, basically in RDRS, the regs allowed you to submit a complaint related to RDRS entities. And this is only for RDRS entities, not for other complaints related to other CalRecycle issues or local issues. So we created a tool basically where you could submit a complaint. That data is then, once you submit it, stored in RDRS. And then we have our staff review team in knowledge integration section and the technical assistance team kind of look at the complaint and then respond back to it. So there's 2 ways to get to it. You can get to it here on the complaints page. On the reports page in this link here called complaints tool. You can also get to it. Well, let me go back to, yeah, so on the main RDRS page that I showed you initially, you can get to it by hitting this button, report RDRS non-compliance. Okay, so this is a complaints page. So basically the text here at the top is kind of explaining what it's about, that you should only use this portal and submit a complaint related to RDRS entities that have issues with inaccurate data, or there's errors found in the data, or other issues. So you're not going to be submitting it for other CalRecycle issues. And here you get a bunch of different links to CalRecycle areas where you can submit complaints related to those issues like tires or recycling services, different areas. So you have some helpful links there if you need to go there for complaints. So what this does is basically bring up all the entities in RDRS. So that's what you see here in this list here. So you can see there's 3,032 total entities you could file a complaint against. But you may want to filter it down. So that's what these filters are for. So if you know who you want to file a complaint against, you can enter the site name or the reporting entity name. So again, I'll do Fremont. I'm not picking on them, but I'm just an easy one I remember. And if you do a search, then it'll find all facilities in the system that have Fremont in the name. So you can see there's the two, the BLT, and then the Fremont Recycling and Transfer Station. And there's some other filters here. You can do filter it by RDS number, uh, or their address information if you know that, or their activity type. If you want to filter it to a certain, like landfills only, you could do that. It would filter it by landfill. But when you actually want to go forth and file the complaint, you select the button, file complaint, that's next to the facility you want to do it for. And that brings up the page where you're going to file the complaint. This kind of repeats the same stuff that was on the other page, talking about, who should file a complaint and who shouldn't, and then the other links. But when you're actually filing it, so it brings in all the information for the entity you chose here. You can file a complaint for a entity that's not in the system. Say if you go back here and you search and search and you couldn't find it, you can hit this button, and basically it'll be the same form, but you have to enter all the information about who you're complaining about, their name, their address, and other info. So you do have that option. But back here, so this is all filled out for you, which is nice. So you don't have to do any of that because that's who you're filing the complaint against. The complaint filer's information section. This is the place where you tell us who you are. You can say you're anonymous and hit this checkbox, and that'll blank out these fields so they're not required when you submit. It does make it harder for us to follow up because it's anonymous and there's no one to talk to. So it's advised that you probably, put your information in of who you are. So that'd be your first name, last name, phone, and email. And then if you're an actual related to an entity that's in RDS already, you can select it here. Oh, sorry. And what that brings up is all the entities in RDRS, so you can filter it and pick one. I'm not going to submit a complaint because this is a real page. I'm just showing you. Okay, so once you pick that, you go to the allegation section, and the main goal here and on what this text talks is like you have to be detailed in describing your complaint. And this text kind of outlines what you should cover in your complaint. So you're entering your complaint on this allegation notes box, and it's pretty big. It gives you 5,000 characters. So you want to try to follow these guidelines for entering your complaint. And then once you do that, if you have supporting documentation that you have, you can check this box, and then we'll get back to you, and you can send it to us then. We don't allow it to be attached here because there could be viruses and things like that. So check that box if you want to provide supporting documentation. And then you hit the I'm not a robot just to make sure you're not spamming and being a robot. And then you can submit the complaint. The complaint will be stored in the RDRS system, and then the staff review team will get back to you probably within the week. I haven't checked on the time frame but it's pretty soon that they get back to you on any kind of complaints. So that's basically it for what I was covering.
All right, great. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that and the thorough walkthrough on the complaints page because we do get additional questions about that.
You want me to stop sharing or stay here for questions or
No,
no, you're
I'm moving on to the
okay.
disposal calculator because we're running a bit behind, and then we're just going to do all the questions at once I get through that part. Share, and then the screen. There we go. Okay, so the reason everything Peter just spoke about is relevant is because in the year, there's a disposal rate calculator that uses the data from RDRS and brings it over into the system to determine the annual per capita rate for your jurisdiction. As Peter pointed out, there is a new field in here called mixed plastic waste export. It's in the tooltip here. You'll find these all throughout the year. If you see a question mark box, it's probably got something helpful in it if you're wondering what the question or the field is about. And AB 881 is the legislation that changed this, and that was a question that I answered in the chat as we were going through. So within the ear calculator, as Peter said, it brings the data over. It was a snapshot from the time, and I believe when I brought it over on July or June 12th, I checked again on the 14th, but the origins process hadn't stopped running since the 12th. So this is pretty much the data that would have been processed, hopefully close of business June 11th, and then it was brought over in the afternoon on June 12th, and that was the last update for the ear data at that point in time. When the after the year is submitted, whatever's in RDRS at that time, we kind of let the data settle out for a couple months as changes are made, either because of this report or just because other facility changes. So whatever's in RDRS toward the end of November, early December, that will get automatically loaded into the final year when we get to that point. Um, so on this page, if you have issues with the misallocation or an issue with misreporting, feel free to change it here. As I mentioned, anything related to misreporting or misallocations that really should be fixed in the RDRS system. So if you have to deal specifically with a facility or ask your hauler to do it, that's where any changes that you would note in this field should go after the year submitted. If it's not a direct RDRS issue as far as like, well, the tons of change in RDRS because it's August and this is the data from June. We will capture that as part of the year review at the end of November, early December. Otherwise, if you're going to change this field or any of these other specific disposal reduction credit fields, we advise you to fill out a reporting year disposal modification certification sheet. It looks like this. And misallocations are very specific, or not modifications are very specific to the categories of items that are allowed for changes to disposal reduction credits. Medical waste is pretty limited. Regional diversion facilities are very limited. For C&D waste, this isn't C&D waste that was recycled or sent to a C&D facility or used as ADC. This is for C&D waste that was used by another or generated by another project that the jurisdiction didn't have any control over. Like the FBI came in and built an office building and they sent all their stuff to the landfill because they wouldn't listen to us. That kind of project or large Caltrans project that affected your disposal total, but it was related to something that you couldn't directly control. So anything that you would hopefully I can make through 20 minutes. Anything that you would be changing on this sheet should have a corresponding modification form. It helps us identify the assistance that may be needed. Or if you're going to do a misallocation, once again, you should work with the facilities as best you can to get that data changed in RDRS, hopefully before the year releases. But afterwards, we will still continue to work with you if it's a legit misallocation that we can get fixed. So after that, I'm not going to make any changes to this. So I am now going to switch over to the Q&A screen and see what we have. So those two. Okay. Are there any reports that show diverted material / non-landfill tonnage? Peter, could you take that one? Because that can
Yes.
be a bit of a sticky wicket for us.
Yeah, we do have a report on that list of reports. I think it was 11 toward the bottom there. And it started in 25 that you could show overall recycling tonnage for general sent to a jurisdiction. It doesn't show it by facility because that's proprietary information, but it will show it if you go back to the main page. Go toward the bottom. Yeah, the recycling and composting related outflows. So it'll show the overall tonnage sent to a jurisdiction. And it's kind of the same interface. You can pick it by quarter. It's probably better to look at it by quarter. And then you could just leave it default or pick a jurisdiction if you want. It may not have tons because it's more specific, but or you can pick multiple jurisdictions.
Do I have to pick a material stream or does it?
No, you don't.
Actually, maybe it goes faster if I do because it won't try to load every piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then it will show you by material type. There's materials divided into three categories. You got the overall category, the subcategory, and then the specific material. And that showed you on the right there when Chris was going through. So it'll show you the tonnages sent to that jurisdiction by facilities, but it's not going to show you the facility information. But you can get a general idea of Alameda Uni and the destination area jurisdiction that it was sent to. So you got the sender jurisdiction and the destination.
Was trying to pick a couple more to add on there, and apparently I didn't pick enough that we're sending stuff.
Yeah.
There we go. There's a few more. All right.
But again, these tonnages aren't in the ear because they're recycling.
Yeah, the calculator I was showing is only for disposal. All right, cool. Thank you, Peter. Hopefully
Mhm.
that answers your question, Alan. Okay. This is an interesting one. Since it is 2026, is it safe to assume that the 2025 disposal data is accurate, up to date? Signed, anonymous participant. Well, it's as up to date as it's been reported. And as I mentioned, the data that comes out that goes into the ear was as of a specific date and time. I can tell you that we've had some revisions to some facility information since then. Those resulted in reductions of tons for about 40 jurisdictions and only increases for two so far. So in that sense, it's good, but no, I did. This is why it's important to get the data in on time from the facilities. We do try to send out that helpful reminder in early mid-May about going in and checking some of this data before the year to make sure it looks accurate and okay. And maybe those dramatic reductions we had for a handful of jurisdictions tonnage wise since the ear release, that might have been a result of someone looking at it and be like, this can't be right, and then it getting revised in the system. So that said, all those jurisdictions that had some kind of reduction so far, and it can still change and go the other way between now and winter. Um, it can still fluctuate. So yes, the 2025 disposal data is accurate, up to date, but still subject to change. Okay, Alexander Bordeaux. Okay, Peter, maybe you can help answer this one. It's,
Sure.
as you can imagine, the January 2025 wildfires in SoCal may have had a significant effect on waste tonnage. Did I read that CalRecycle is already tracking disaster waste separately, and thus we should not be seeing these tons as part of the disposal rate calculation?
Yeah, that is correct. Per the regs, disaster waste is a separate stream and it's not counted as disposal or tracked by jurisdiction. So if a facility is reporting receiving disaster waste, they're reporting that in a separate stream. It's not under disposal. So if they report it correctly that it was disaster waste, then it should not be showing up as jurisdiction disposal.
Yes, and that would be anything categorized as disaster waste as during the facility. There may be residual tons from further demolition down the road that, if it's not recycled and it is disposed and it's not listed particularly as related to the disaster, that could end up influencing your overall disposal. But that's kind of a discussion for a different day. But yes, anything that's specifically marked as disaster waste as part of either the CalRecycle cleanup contracts or as it goes into the landfill, excuse me, if it's noted as disaster, it does not show up in your disposal total. It's a totally separate stream. Okay. Hey, Olivia Sanchez. We saw some jurisdictions for quarter 4 seemed low. Our land rep helped us look at it. It's possible that not all the data was entered. Can the ear still be submitted despite these discrepancies? And we have reached out to the facility for reporting clarification. Yes, of course it can. As I mentioned, the number that you're seeing in the ear on the day that we loaded it, that is the disposal as of that day. This number would be subject to change as anything fluctuates. If you get it fixed by this facility in question, you can go ahead and put that number in. And then when we're getting ready to finalize these, one, we kind of compare the tonnage that has been entered to what's maybe in RDRS. And it's like, okay, you might put in, 100 instead of 188,000, you might change it to 180. And when we're looking at RDRS at the end of November, early December, and it's 180 and change or 181. It's like that's pretty close because whatever change you were trying to get, it might have gone into effect, but then there could have been a different change somewhere else downstream that then added a couple other tons. So it's always in fluctuation until you submit. So yes, you can definitely submit, change the tonnage, don't change it, as if it gets fixed in RDRS in the next 5 months or so, it will be reflected in your final number. Okay, so let us move along to some other parts now that we have answered all the questions related to disposal. So at this point, I would like to hand off the presentation to Adriana Saliot, who is going to discuss procurement and a couple other sections and interesting training points we'd like to bring up. And thank you so much, Peter, for your great presentation and helping to answer all those questions.
Thank you, everyone. See you next year.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Adriana, and I'm one of the senior environmental scientists in LAMD. For the rest of the webinar, Chris and I will be going through the rest of the reporting sections in the EAR. A few updates were made, so I will walk us through these changes and highlight some reporting features. The data being entered into the reports will be for demonstration purposes only and does not accurately reflect the jurisdiction's programs. Okay,
Adriana,
so
on your screen yet?
no, not yet.
Oh, okay, good. Cool.
Okay, I will be doing that now, so just one moment. Okay, can you all see the annual report?
Yep, Napa's procurement screen.
Okay, perfect. So starting with the procurement section, to edit this section, you will need to click the edit button here for editing access. In case you want to look through the entire report, or excuse me, this section, we do have one located at the very bottom too. So I'll go ahead and click on this. After doing so, you'll be able to see which parts of this section are open for editing. So I'll go ahead and move up to the beginning of the section. So this first grid here will display the jurisdiction's procurement target. If you have a low population waiver or a rule exemption, this should show up as 0. With the recent passing of AB 2902 and 2346, jurisdictions were provided additional options for complying with the procurement requirements, including the opportunity to reduce their procurement target. If your jurisdiction was granted a reduced procurement target in 2025, that new target should already be reflected here. If you're not familiar with these two statutes, we do have them hyperlinked here in case you would like to check them out to learn more. We used to have another note here that was for AB 1985. We did decide to remove it since starting in 2025, jurisdictions should have started procuring 100% of their procurement target. But okay, moving on, right below is the recovered organic waste product procured, SLCP grid. Here you'll be reporting on the products that were procured in 2025. And depending on the data reported in this grid, you will see the number reflected in the annual procurement field above. We did make changes in this grid, so I'll go ahead and walk you through that in a little bit. We'll go ahead and click this edit button for this grid so that we can enter the amounts for our procurement program. After doing that, you'll be in the edit view. At the top here, you will often see instructions or more tooltips to give you additional guidance on how to complete the grid correctly. So scrolling down, you'll see a list of the recovered organic waste products that can be counted towards a procurement target. Each has a red asterisk, which indicates that all of these are required fields. For any product that does not apply to your procurement in 2025, you can just go ahead and enter 0. You'll see that for the 2025 year, we did add new products to reflect what is now allowed under AB 2346. I do want to take a moment to highlight some important notes with these additions. So one, you'll notice a few of these products are duplicative. Like for instance, we have vermicomposting operations here and then also right below. So this was done to give jurisdictions the opportunity to either report in tons or in cubic yards. So when filling out this information, if it is applicable to your procurement, please do not enter the information more than once, because then you'll be contributing to double counting. 2, the amount of edible food recovered should be reported in tons and not in pounds. Also, this number should reflect the edible food recovered from commercial edible food generators within your own jurisdiction. Also, in AB 2346, the amount of edible food recovery plus mulch from tree trimmings cannot exceed 10% of a jurisdiction's procurement target. For example, this jurisdiction has a procurement target of 6,352. Therefore, the total amount of edible food recovery plus mulch from tree trimmings combined cannot exceed 635.2 tons. And the last note is basically the same rule as these two categories for these last three. So for the dollar amount spent on investments for community composting operations and equipment that is used to apply compost or mulch, and the development of compost or mulch distribution sites, together cannot exceed 10% of a jurisdiction's procurement target. The conversion factor for 1 ton is $21.38. So for these three categories combined, the total amount should not exceed $13,580.57. When you do enter amounts that exceed that 10% limit, you will receive an error message when you click the Save button for the procurement section. So just to show you an example of what that error message will look like, I went ahead and pre-populated these categories with data that does exceed that 10% limit. So as you can see, it'll let me save here. But when I scroll up to save the information entered for this section, these two error messages are popping up for me. So when you are at this point, I do recommend doing your calculation in the beginning so that you don't end up running into this issue when you're entering your data in this part of the year. For conversion factors of each procurement type or product type, we do have them all available in the EAR user guide that Chris pointed out at the beginning of this webinar. And that was pretty much it for the updates. No changes were made to the rest of this section. So I'll go ahead and give us a moment to pause for questions.
Okay, we do have a couple. So let's start with Kimberly Nilsson. What was the dollars to tons amount again, please, in procurement? That might be asking about the conversion factor, and the conversion factor for each of the investment for community composting operations, equipment that used to apply compost or mulch, or the development of compost or mulch distribution sites is the dollar number, and it's divided by 21.38. I will also drop that into the answer. And then one other question from Billy Hansen. It would be helpful in this section to notate which ones need the Muni Code ordinance to be updated in order to claim. Billy, I'm going to ask you to unmute possibly, and maybe you can elaborate on that one a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I may be wrong, so please correct me if I am, but I was under the impression that certain of the new categories under the recovered organic waste product procured, under some of the new categories, in order to claim credits for those, you would have to update your municipal code or ordinance. One that I think falls under that would be the mulching and the tree, like the tree mulching. From what I read, I thought that it said in order to claim those tons, you do have to update your city ordinance or municipal code. Is that correct?
Hi, Billy.
RT, yeah, thank you.
Yep,
Let's
jumping
take
in.
this one.
Yes, so for mulch from tree trimmings, jurisdictions do have to have an ordinance or an enforceable mechanism in order to meet the land application requirements for the mulch. And that is also the case for the compost, the new recovered organic waste products, the vermicomposting, community composting, and mushroom composting. We don't have that outlined in the ear, but I will drop our guidance document in the chat. And this is something that we'll take note for next year. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm making a note too to see if we can adjust something in the tooltips or elsewhere to help address that. Thank you. Okay, next up from Matthew Nichols. For the 10% cap, is that based on total procurement or just the target amount? Also, if we procure more than the target, can we report the overprocurement or is the reporting capped at the target? Well, I can tell you in the reporting, as Adriana showed, the reporting, let's, in the example she has on the screen, Adriana, if you want to go back to the edit mode a little bit. If you input over the amount, as the initial numbers she had in there were under the amount, but she went a little bit over, it gave that error. So even if mulch, if you procured, in this case, 400 or 500, it's only going to allow you to report up to in this case, 3.17.6, combined with the other field. It's only going to allow you to report that much. Otherwise, you'll get the error message in the reporting and you won't be able to proceed to the next section. RT, you have extra?
Yep. So the 10% applies to the procurement target. So for mulch from tree trimmings and edible food recovery, together that can be up to 10% of your jurisdiction's procurement target. And the same applies to the investments. Altogether, cumulatively, they can be up to 10% of the jurisdiction's procurement target. And then, like Chris mentioned, you will not be able to save in the year if it's more than that 10%.
All right, thank you. And we have a similar question from the city of Avalon. Why are some of the items limited to 10% of the procurement? Well, that's probably a question for a different day unless someone's got some background info.
I don't have any information.
Okay. I think it's just because that's how they settled on whatever the negotiations were in the legislation. And
Mhm.
if you have more than 10%, as we've mentioned, you will be
O-
able to put in
Only
up to that
report up to
amount.
10%. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Next up from Andrew Caravejo. Would grass cycling operations in city parks qualify for procurement targets?
So for procurement, there's only certain recovered organic waste products that can qualify to meet the procurement target. So, under 1383, there's compost, mulch, RNG, and electricity from biomass conversion. And then now, under AB 2346 and 2902, we have some new options, but those are also limited to, as you can see, compost, different types of compost. Um, Mulch from tree trimming operations, some from edible food recovery, and investments in composting operations. So I don't think it would, but I do recommend that you reach out to your land rep and we can talk specifics and see what your situation is.
Awesome. Thank you, RT. Yeah, I wanted to add that we know this is kind of new. There's probably a lot of questions, as RT mentioned. Please reach out to your land rep to kind of go over some of these details. There's probably a lot of weird nuance and other um, ways to fulfill these items. And yeah, RT put the guidance document in there. And the other thing I'll put this in the chat as well is we went over a lot of this in depth and detail at our CalRecycle chat from last month. So I'm going to put the link to that YouTube in the chat for you all. So if you have, you need more background, more detail, you missed that chat, that one's got a lot more specific information related to this. Not so much about the reporting, but about what qualifies, what doesn't. How do we, how do we keep track of this? Everything in your implementation records probably always a good idea. So yeah, there's a lot here. So please reach out to your land rep if you have further questions. And I'm not seeing anything else in the Q&A box. So yeah, if you think of something else as the webinar goes on, please put it back in and we'll see if we'll have time to come back to it at the end. So at this point, we will move on to the next section, which is edible food. And we're not going to do a full demo on this section. It's not super complicated. Nothing else has changed. But we do want to specifically mention that, for you reporters, it's super important that the 2025 data is correct because guess what? It's a SB 1383 goal year. So this is going to be data that is used to see if we're fulfilling the statewide goal. So it's going to be very important that it's as accurate as possible. And a kind of a specific trend along with that we want to point out, I'm sure Adriana will get to it, is that, if you have 0 FROs, there should be 0 reported weight. If you have an FRO, you should probably have some weight. But also, whatever nuances or anything else, there's always that explanation box. So I will turn it back over to Adriana to cover edible food and whatever comes next.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so um, like Chris mentioned, nothing has changed, but we do want to clarify a few reporting aspects of this section. So we want to clarify that for school districts spread across multiple jurisdictions, only the jurisdiction where the district office is located should be including the local education agency in their number of commercial edible food generators. And just to elaborate a little bit more on what Chris mentioned earlier in regards to total pounds of edible food recovered, please remember food recovery and food recovery organizations and services are required to report to one jurisdiction, which is the jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located. So if you do not have any food recovery organizations or food recovery services located within your jurisdiction, then you will enter 0 here. Okay, believe those are the only two items that we wanted to clarify. I'll go ahead and move on to the next section, which is our collection systems section. Okay, I will admit this section is more complicated than the other reporting sections in the EAR, so I'll just go ahead and dive in. We'll first click this edit button for editing access. This first grid here is where you will be providing data on your jurisdiction's collection container systems. You'll need to click the edit button here for editing access. After doing so, I want to first point out that this grid does have its own left to right scroll bar, which can be easily missed. And it's important for you to have access or know where it's located because it does give you the ability to access the Save button. Okay. Now let's just go ahead and scroll back and scroll up. So if you are a jurisdiction with a department issued waiver or exemption, you will see an option to check a box here under the hauler name to indicate the type of waiver or exemption your jurisdiction has. This will only show up in your report if it applies to your jurisdiction, but by checking the box, the system will allow you to bypass certain required fields of this grid. If you're an unincorporated county with waived census tracts, you may check the low population box, but it is very important to note that you are still required to fill out this section to report the container collection system and number of generators in census tracts that are not waived. So the hauler name field here isn't required, but you may want to specify if you are a jurisdiction with multiple haulers and multiple collection system types. We do understand that jurisdictions have very unique collection systems. So for this part of today's webinar, I'm going to do my best to walk you through this grid so that you can better understand how to report for your collection system accurately. Okay, so for today's demonstration, we'll go ahead and make up a scenario where this jurisdiction has two haulers. One collects material from residential generators, while the other hauler collects material from commercial generators. Since the jurisdiction has two haulers in this scenario, we will go ahead and enter hauler 1 here. And let's go ahead and report for the residential systems first. So I will leave this box here unchecked. Let's say this hauler provides a 2-container green-gray collection system. Here you can select the container type, even though the field is not required. But since I'll go ahead and select green-gray, just to specify that that is the type of 2-container system that is being provided to this jurisdiction's residential generators. Next, you will go ahead and select the type of containers that is being provided, and then you will enter the number of generators the system is offered to. So let's go ahead and keep it at 30. Then I will check this box here to indicate that this hauler does not provide services to commercial generators. And scroll down, we have an additional description box here in case you want to elaborate more to paint a clearer picture for our department. So using this left to right scroll bar, I'll go ahead and scroll right and click the Save button. So one thing I want to point out in going back to this grid is there are required fields. So if I were to miss one, like let me delete this as an example, and attempt to save, you'll see that the grid is still open in editing view, but in order for you to see what's preventing you from saving the information in this grid, you have to scroll back left and then scroll back up to see the error message. Okay. So now we want to go ahead and add information for the jurisdiction's commercial collection system. At this point, you will need to select this Add Additional Hauler button. After doing so, you will see that the hauler name is now required. And for this case, we'll go ahead and just reference or enter hauler 2. I will then check this box to indicate that this hauler does not collect residential material. Then it'll let me bypass these fields. Now under commercial systems, for this hauler, let's say they offer a 3-container system or implement a 3-container system for the commercial generators. So even though it's not required, I want to go ahead and specify that it is the gray, blue, green 3-container system. Check off 3 containers here. Enter the number of generators. Let's go ahead and say there's 100 generators for their commercial program. So before I move on, I want to specify what number should be entered here. So this should represent how your jurisdiction and or hauler processes materials, not the number of containers that a generator has on site. So this number should include all commercial generators, including those with waivers, if your jurisdiction is providing them. For example, this jurisdiction has 100 commercial generators, and let's say 50 of them were issued a waiver. You would still put or enter 100 here. The number of generators who were issued a waiver in 2025 are actually going to be reported in a separate section of the EAR, which is the waivers and exemptions section. Okay, so since I selected a 3-container system, it's going to ask if you allow organics in the gray container. We'll go ahead and say no. And again, another opportunity to add information to the additional description box in case you would like to provide more context. And then once you're done entering your information, you'll click the Save Hauler button here. Okay, so the scenario that I used did include 2 haulers with different collection systems, but I want to clarify that if your jurisdiction only offers one type of container collection system, there is no need to utilize the Add Additional Haulers feature for this grid. Okay, and that is it for that grid. The next grid is the compostable plastics and plastics allowed in the green container and collection facilities grid. So here, after clicking edit, you will report whether or not compostable plastics are allowed in your collection system's green container. To show you what you'll need to do if it is a yes answer, you'll need to specify or identify the facility. You can go ahead and type the facility name here or utilize the Select RDRS facility feature below. If you do decide to go this route, I want to point out that this list is not alphabetical, but you may use the Control F feature to select your facility. The next part of this grid is asking if organics are allowed to be placed in plastic bags in the green container. If your response is yes, you would need to do the same. You would need to identify the facility. Okay, and that is that for that section. And of course, if you want to add more information, you can do so here. Next, we have the organic waste haulers grid. Here you will identify your haulers and identify the facility that the organic waste is hauled to. The last grid for this section is the high diversion organic waste processing facilities grid. The regulations do require that material in a single container system and material in the gray container of a two container system are processed at a high diversion organic waste processing facility. So in the scenario that I presented, since the residential hauler provided a two container system, I will have to select the RDS number for the high diversion facility that that material is hauled to. And again, Control F if you want to use the feature. And that is basically it for this section. We'll go ahead and pause for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Adriana. Always the funnest section of the year. There's a number of pieces in there. So first question from Christine Williamson. So under the impression the number of generators we were reporting are only numbers of those subject to 1383, especially as we have generators and wave census tracts that only have one container, but it is not a container going to a high diversion facility.
Hi, Christine. Are you able to unmute and
Yeah, sorry, I was getting to that. I was trying to like process the question in my head. I'm like, I'm gonna have to ask her to
yeah, I
mention
don't
that
quite
again.
understand.
No.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry. I know I kind of changed my question partway through writing it.
It did have a question mark at the end. That's what was
And then,
throwing me off.
okay. Well, and I know I ask questions every year, sorry. I was asking because I thought when we're putting the information into this section and we click, one container, that means that it's the number of generators that have one container that's going to a high diversion facility. But when you started off, you mentioned that if we have, because I'm from, sorry, Christine Williamson, Kern County Public Works, Kern County unincorporated jurisdiction. But we have lots of census tracts with a lot of people who have been waived. And so I was under the impression at the beginning, I thought you said that we do select low population, but we still report the numbers of those with a single container in the waived areas in this section, or maybe I misunderstood that.
I think so. This section, you should be reporting on the jurisdiction's collection system. So if the county has a 3-container system, then you would select 3 containers and put the number of generators that have a 3-container system. And then your question is specifically for, since you're a county and some areas are waived, right? And those don't have the green container or one of
right. So I'm sorry. To be a little more clear, so we have multiple different systems in place because we have multiple areas that are subject to different regulations as far as this goes. So we have lots of customers in areas, the SB 1383 required areas that have the 3+ containers. We self-haul aside, that's a whole other issue. We also have areas that are waived, and so they only have one cart, but that's not a cart that is subject to going to a high diversion facility. And again, this may be just that I misunderstood the beginning of this section. But I had always thought that those numbers, the ones that have the single cart but are not subject to having to be in one of these collection systems, were not numbers that we reported in here.
Correct. And so if you'll notice in your ear, you probably have like a low population waiver section that you can check. But because you're a county, so let's say you're a jurisdiction, you have a low population waiver, so that can be checked and bypass this whole section, so you don't have to enter information. But because you're a county and only certain areas are waived, you would still check that box for low population waiver and enter the generators that have the 3-container system. And then Adriana will go over in a little bit the waiver section where you would enter the number the number of generators that are waived from organics collection. So that's where you would enter the census tracts, the generators in the census tracts that are waived.
Okay. Yeah, that actually kind of answers a little bit better. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And Christine, I did answer it also in the Q&A section for you, but I will read the awesome, super approved answer we have for this. That is kind of a blanket statement, but in these situations, this applies to anyone who's got some of these more complicated things. If you have a unique or complicated hauling system, the recommendation is to include more information in the additional description box, which will help Jace understand the unique qualities of the collection system for each hauler. As noted, that each jurisdiction shall report the following relative to its implementation of the organic waste collection requirements of Article 3 of this chapter. The type of organic waste collection service provided by the jurisdiction to its generators, the type of organic waste collection services, or and the total number of generators that receive each type of organic waste collection service provided by the jurisdiction. Sorry, the box moved on me as I was reading that. So yes, once again, if you have something unique or something complicated or very distinct to you, always put more information in that additional description box, because that will definitely help Jace when they're going through it later on. Okay. Next up, this is a good one from our anonymous participant. Should we include C&D and temporary service haulers too? Well, specific to C&D, no. Exclusive C&D haulers do not need to be included as organic waste haulers. But temporary service hauler, I don't know what exactly that might encompass. And since you're anonymous, I can't ask you to unmute. But I think the next bet for you regarding what you mean by temporary service haulers, follow up with your land rep on that one. Because yeah, C&D does not need to be, but I don't know what this temporary service hauler that might be hauling organics for a month or two or how that might work. So definitely follow up with your land rep and/or put a note in the additional description. Okay, and next up, another from anonymous participant. Because you're entering the total number of generators in a particular waste shed or under a specific hauler, would you never check more than one option, 3-container, 3-container, 2-container, 1, for each hauler waste shed? We are a county and have 3 different waste sheds, 1 3+, 1 3, 1 1, technically all the same hauler. We would be entering in as separate haulers, but it sounds like we aren't reporting the number of containers subscribed to, just the total number of generators in that waste shed. That's a little complicated. RT, do you want to take a stab at that, or should we have them mail this to the Logic mailbox and not as an anonymous participant so we can follow staff?
Yes.
Okay.
Send it to the Logic, but let me just generally say again that the container system that should be reported in this section is your jurisdiction's container system. So, it does not include any de minimis waivers, physical space waivers, or any jurisdiction waivers that you issued here. So if a hauler has a 3+ container system, you would select that. You should not have multiple ones per hauler. If you do have different container systems, then like Adriana was entering, you could enter it as a separate hauler, if that makes sense. But do reach out to us, your land rep, or our inbox, so we can go over your specific year and help you.
Yeah, perfect answer. Thank you, RT. Yeah, that's a more complicated one, and we would probably need to know a little more, and your land rep can definitely help you out. We also had a question about a list of the approved high diversion organic waste processing facilities. I put a link to that in the chat for all of you. Okay, another anonymous participant. Can the organic debris that was created during a windstorm be added to this section? I think follow up with your land rep, because organic debris from a windstorm would be collected in some way. I don't know if you're talking about like you had a big debris box out and you had to pick up trees, or from like in Sacramento we have the claw and whatever to do with that. Follow up with your land rep on that one, because windstorm seems awfully specific to a regular commercial or residential collection system. Okay. All right. That looks to be it on the collection system section. Thank you for bearing with us. We're over the hump on this. All the hardest stuff has been done. And if you have anything else on collections, we'll see if we can get to it at the end, though we're going to be wrapping up on time here soon. And or please send it to your land rep or the Logic mailbox. Okay, next up, and I got to get my screen back because I am on now. No. Share. Okay, so next two sections, I'm not going to go in depth on either of these, but they are fairly simple. Commercial programs and residential programs both consist of a series of checkboxes for materials collected, as well as these SHRI program notes. If you're an experienced reporter, you would be familiar with these. They were the main crux of the year and your previous planning documents that were approved by the Integrated Waste Management Board however many years ago. To complete this section, you got to make sure you check off every box of each diversion program, as well as add any additional products procured. And if you need specific detail on these diversion programs, this briefly described the program note box will allow you to enter a note that is up to 2,500 characters. If you need to enter a longer or more detailed note, after you check the box, each program will turn into a hyperlink, and then you'll be able to go into the specific page for that program and add a longer note. And or we don't really recommend changing the start year or the target sectors or the program status, because really the program status, all you can do at this point is generally drop it. But if you need to put more detailed info for a specific program, you would do that from this screen. And the last bit on commercial programs, and this is one that does trip people up a little bit, is in the venues and events section. Back to edit. You do have the ability to copy an event, a venue, or an event from the previous year. And after or you can add a new event if you have a new thing to add. After you've copied the event from previous year, it'll bring over like 95% of the data from the previous event, but not quite all of it. And this is where people get a little tripped up. After you've added the event, you're going to want to go in, it'll say complete or incomplete. The way to complete it is to pick the event, and then on the practices page, you need to pick an implementation level and enter tons. If you don't have the specific divert and dispose tons, you can feel free to put in the zeros right there. That at least will complete the section. And then, on the basic info page, if you weren't getting any info, there is a checkbox to say they didn't really give us tons or whatever. So that way it's kind of clear that well, that's why it's zeros, because they don't know, because the venue wasn't cooperating. But we do know the venue exists. So that's a good start. So then back on the commercial programs page, it no longer says incomplete right here, and you would be able to move on and complete this section, and it's got a green check mark. Same thing with residential. Once again, just a series of check boxes. as well as diversion program notes. So you'd want to have at least one each checked off and or add a note to complete the section, which I did not do, and that's why I'm getting an error. And now we're going to move on to education outreach, and I'm going to hand it back to Adriana.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so nothing has changed for education and outreach. When editing these grids, you will need to select the type of education and outreach that was provided to generators in 2025, and then enter the number of generators that received that material. And you will also need to describe the education outreach program for these program requirements. Okay, we'll go ahead and cancel so that I can move on. And the same goes for edible food recovery, what was provided to commercial edible food generators. So again, nothing has changed, so we'll go ahead and move on to Mwelo, CalGreen, C&D, and other programs. Nothing major has changed here, so fill in the information as required. Next is the household hazardous waste programs. This is very similar to the commercial programs and residential programs that Chris just went over. So this is all related to diversion program notes for your jurisdiction's SHRI. So check the box and provide information as needed. Since Chris went over the next two sections, we'll go ahead and move on to waivers and exemptions. Okay, for this one, I'll actually move on to a different jurisdiction just to give you a better sense as to what shows up if you have a rural exemption or low population waiver. Okay, we'll go ahead and click the edit button to gain editing access. So for the first grid, this is covering department issued waivers. If you have an approved department issued waiver or exemption, you will see an option here to check off a box for the type you were issued. So only jurisdictions with a rural exemption and or low population waiver should have a number to report in this field for the generators waived from the requirement to subscribe to an organics collection service. If your jurisdiction does not, you will enter 0 here. This applies to those of you with elevation waivers too. Elevation waivers do not waive organic waste collection. They instead waive the requirement to separate and recover food waste and food soiled paper. Therefore, those of you with elevation waivers should also report zeros for this field. So going back to, I think, an earlier part of this webinar where there was a little bit of confusion on the collection systems, the generators and waived census tracts will be reported in this part of the report. Okay, and that is what I wanted to clarify for this grid. But before I move on, I just want to remind everyone that low population waivers are valid for 5 years. If your jurisdiction was issued a low population waiver in 2022, your waiver will be expiring next year. If you haven't already reached out or if your LAMD rep hasn't connected with you yet, they will be reaching out to you soon. Well, specifically those of you with upcoming expirations to offer assistance with the reapplication process. I also want to clarify that your jurisdiction cannot reapply for a waiver until 180 days before your waiver expires. So your LAMB rep, when they connect with you, they'll also help clarify that time frame. Okay, next is the jurisdiction issued waivers grid. I think this question was already addressed in the Q&A, but I'll go ahead and say it now. The number entered for these two fields should only reflect the waivers that were issued in 2025. Separate to this, I also want to point out that if your jurisdiction has a waiver program, that a friendly reminder that the waivers are also valid for 5 years. So if you started issuing waivers in 2022, those waivers are set to expire in 2027. And according to the regulations, the jurisdiction must verify at this time through an inspection that these commercial generators are still meeting the de minimis and/or physical space waiver requirements. And now the last part of this section is for more exemptions. This section is only for jurisdictions that have a department issued waiver or exemption, but are still required to implement more. For those of you that do not have a department issued waiver or exemption, you can just enter 0 here. Okay, we'll go ahead and pause for any questions.
I was putting in some clarification regarding the jurisdiction issued waivers. I'll be putting that in the chat just regarding this idea that you have to go back through and inspect them after 5 years. So that is now in the chat for everyone to see. So questions? Back to disposal rate section, Billy, we will see if we have time in the next 15 minutes. We'll see how the next bit of Q&A goes. Otherwise, yeah, please contact your land rep. And from Bryce Hagan, how should jurisdiction waiver re-verification figures be documented? Should these be reported as waivers issued during the calendar year, or should an additional description note be included as to a number of re-verifications performed? I guess that's a good question because, as we said, we were asking you to only put the new waivers issued in this year. If it's a matter of re-verification, is that considered issuing a new one, or is that extending the existing one? You know, Bryce, that is a really good question. If you could send that to the Logic inbox and your land rep, we will get back to you. RT, do you have anything to add on that one? I haven't think I've heard that come up yet, especially as far as how it would need to be reported.
I was thinking that we might be incorporating that in future reports.
Yeah, because it hasn't happened yet for this year.
Exactly.
So maybe next year. Okay, that's a good point. I will add that to notes. Yeah, good. Excellent question. Hadn't even thought of that. Is the reissuing of a waiver the same as issuing it for that year? That is an excellent idea. Okay, thank you, Bryce. Okay, anonymous participant. Can an inspection be a desktop audit? No, anonymous participant, it cannot. It requires a site visit. I put a clarification in the chat so everyone can see it, but the definition of it includes verifying through inspection and a site visit. So a desk audit does not accomplish the requirements for renewing the waiver because it must be verified through inspection. And inspection means site visit. If you have further questions, definitely contact your land rep. I'm sure this will come up more and more as we get closer to 2027 when waivers were first starting to get issued. Okay, that is it for the questions. So let's try to move along. We're going to be fairly quick on the rest of these. So Adriana, if you'd like to jump into the contamination enforcement sections, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So for the contamination inspections and complaints section, nothing has changed. Just click the edit button and then click the edit button for each grid and enter data that reflects what your jurisdiction conducted in 2025. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to enforcement and monitoring. This will be the last section that I will be covering for today's webinar. So I want to point out that statute still requires jurisdictions to report for Assembly Bill 1826 and Assembly Bill 341, so often referred to as more an MCR. So in this section, you as a jurisdiction will still need to report for those two and including SB 1383. The EAR was structured to reduce the burden on jurisdictions as much as possible when reporting in areas where there's potential overlap in the laws. So if all of your generators are captured in this first grid, the SLCP grid, you can report the same numbers in the More section and MCR section below. For those of you that have a department issued waiver or exemption, an option for you will appear here in the SLCP grid, which will let you bypass its required fields. However, you will still need to report for the More and MCR section. Okay, and that is all that I wanted to cover for that section. I'll pass it back to you, Chris.
Thank you. So next up, get mine back up again. There we go. This window. Okay, so to facilities. Facilities, once again, pretty simple and set up. Oh wait, sorry, enforcement monitoring. Oh wait, no, we just facilities. Sorry, got too many screens open. I'm getting lost in all these little Zoom windows. Okay, facilities. This is a lot like the commercial program and residential programs, but it doesn't even have the check boxes for materials. All you got to do in this is come in and check off the facility diversion program sections you have. And once again, you can add a brief note up to 2,500 characters. And it gave me an error because I forgot to check a box. So I do get this question in the inbox quite a bit throughout the year reporting season where someone's on one of these sections where it's not letting them get through. It's usually because there's going to be one box not checked. And depending on how many programs you have, I can see why it can be easy to get lost in all these. But this one didn't accept it because I left one like that. And now green. Infrastructures and barriers. This is something that's really pretty light. If you have any large changes since the submittal of your previous county capacity planning report a couple of years ago, please list that here. If nothing, just press no and you can move along. Enforceable mechanisms and ordinances, another fairly simple section. If you had changes to the ordinance, you can describe it. If you don't have, unless you have a new ordinance of some type, you don't need to send anything in. We should already have copies of most of them from the initial jurisdiction compliance report that was due in April 2022. But if you have anything changes or adjusted, feel free to adjust to mention that here. This could be something, as was mentioned earlier, about qualifying for certain procurement targets. If you need to adjust your mulch ordinance, this would be a good place to mention it. Same thing with contact changes. If you have changes to your SLCP primary or SLCP official contacts, it's going to preload whoever currently is. Feel free to change it. We'll note that the SLCP official, per Jace's policy, really needs to be a jurisdiction employee. It can't be, a consultant or someone else. There might be a little bit of adjustment on that depending on JPA agreement between a joint powers authority and a regional agency, or a joint powers authority that's not a regional agency. That would be an adjustment, but generally the SLCP official should be a city employee. Planning documents, I don't really typically need to do a lot on here other than generally say no to a lot of things. For the most part, planning documents don't really need to be revised. By completing this annual report, you are making updates to your SHRI and your WHI. That's much different than a revision. A revision is a much bigger political process with large documents and hearings, and no one wants to go through that. So generally, you're updating your SHRI and WHI by doing this report itself, so revisions aren't really needed. non-disposal facility agreement or this facility element. If you're having a change to come up, this is a good place to warn us, but there is a separate process for that is outlined on the web page that you'll find linked here. Basically, just have to send us a letter and a document update. We update the files, and that way, if there's going to be a conformance finding for a new solid waste facility permit of some type, it's already in there and ready to go. Summary plan assessment, you don't really need to do anything. That's just the bow on top of the rest of the original planning docs. There's no reason you'd really need to revise it at this point. And the siting element assessment, it might need to be revised if you have less than 15 years of disposal capacity, or you're possibly going to be siting an engineered municipal solid waste facility. You might need to adjust your siting element, or if you're siting a new landfill of some type, you might need to adjust your siting element. But for the most part, most places do not, though I think there might be one or two coming up that we are aware of that might require that. Last up, the additional information section. This is really just kind of a summary of your diversion program codes. If there's anything else you might want to adjust in any of these, this would be a chance. This will take you back to that same diversion program detail page here. If you want to go in and change anything, you can, but once again, we don't recommend really changing too much of the top info. And then in the additional information section, this is pretty broad. You can mention anything else that you might want to say, anything else that wasn't captured in any other fields. And you also have the ability to update any additional documents you'd like to share with us as part of your report. There's no required documents you need to add. One question we got prior to the webinar regarding documentation required to prove what you were putting in the procurement section was correct. You don't really need to submit that with the ear. Like, we're not looking for that. If you do, cool. But you really don't need to. All that documentation should be part of your implementation record. And if you have questions on that, please contact your land rep. But once again, you don't have to submit any other specific documentation related to procurement or other programs using that button. So last up, this report is clearly not complete, but when it's done, there would be an additional button here at the bottom. And just to give you an idea of what that would look like when it's done and you're ready to submit, I'm gonna switch reports over to one that's done. So when it's complete and each section is ready, you're going to have all green checkboxes here. And on the submit confirmation page, you can download a PDF report summary using this button. Might take a little while my Chrome is trying to update, and it just takes a while in staging. So you can get a PDF, you can send it to your boss, have whoever review it, and you can download that before you're done or when you're close to done. And then when you're actually done, 31 minutes, I'm going to make it. You can then press, yes, I want to submit my annual report. And then you, the person submitting it, will get an email saying, thank you for submitting. If we have questions, we'll get back to you. Have a great summer. No, it doesn't say that, but depends on when you're submitting it, because we already do have a couple that have been turned in. And with that, I am going to go back to the Q&A and see if there's anything else that we can address here in the next few minutes. So, how can we delete programs from our ear that are no longer applicable? From Carlos Chavez. So if you mean deleting programs, if you mean by deleting a diversion program, those little sections with the, there's my email. If you mean deleting a diversion program, that is something you would be doing from the detail page here. I need to press edit on that page and to press edit on this next one. That would be something where you would come in and then you would change the program status from selected and ongoing or selected and implemented or alternative and ongoing, alternative implement. You would change it to dropped. And then once that's dropped here, you would need to provide an explanation and ideally a note as to why it's dropped. Drop programs or depending on what it's for, might be a bit of a red flag. So you'd want to provide a really good explanation as to why you're dropping it. We know we have some older notes about setting up composting facilities that are maybe decades old. Maybe the plan's still there, or maybe they're finally realizing like, yeah, maybe this isn't happening. So that's how you would drop a specific diversion program. Alexander Bordeaux. So the only new questions on this year's EAR were the 11 new data collection fields in the procurement section. Yes, those are the only new questions. Additionally, we have the specific new field in the disposal rate calculator. And as Peter mentioned, it's not a really big impact as far as this mixed plastic waste export. I think it was 21 jurisdiction, 9,000 tons. And I think, as Peter showed on the RDRS reports, 3,000 of those 9,000 are from the LARA member cities in Los Angeles County. So while it's a number, it's there. It's not a lot, but it is also new in addition to procurement. Okay. And that is the last question. So Billy, let's get back to your final question. This is the last one in the queue. We're almost there, folks. For disposal rate calculation, if a disposal facility identifies and corrects a jurisdiction allocation error by amending its RDRS data, should the jurisdiction still submit a disposal adjustment in the EAR, or should we simply wait for the corrected RDRS data to populate and use the updated disposal totals? You can actually do either one. So as we mentioned, like this is the number from July or from June 12th. Let's say in RDRS right now, it is 219,000, or no, let's say instead of it was 188, and let's say you want to be 180,000, and you press save and you submit it as this. If you give us a disposal modification form, you don't have to because it's as simple as being like, this is what it is in RDRS. We'll get to that. Having the form helps. You can also put a little note here on the calculation factors page about, current RDRS number as of, 6/24/26, something to that extent. But as I mentioned, whatever is changed in RDRS, when the EAR is finalized, we're going to go with whatever number's there, minus any other disposal rate or disposal reduction credits you might ask for. So yeah, if you're making a big deduction, but in some cases it's already changed in RDRS, we're probably going to pick up on that. As I mentioned, we did have, since the EAR released, there were already a number of facilities that have revised their numbers down for certain cities. Not to call anyone out, but congrats, Oakland, for getting a fairly large reduction so far. Hopefully it's not a single like fluctuation, but yeah, there were a number of jurisdictions that had big deductions since the year opened. And that RDRS data is probably going to continue to change over the next few months as jurisdictions mentions things to their haulers or their facilities, and or as maybe as one jurisdiction has a change, but then that affects other jurisdictions downstream from the transfer facility, or maybe everything got assigned to the unincorporated instead of the cities, and maybe that's going to get divvied up a little differently. And that's where all those changes happening in RDRS are better, because if an unincorporated county were to lose 100,000 tons, did it just disappear, or did it get reallocated to the other jurisdictions in that county? So Billy, hopefully that answers your question on that. If you have further, please contact your land rep. Yeah, they can go a lot of different ways, but as far as what you want to submit to us, it's up to you. But if you put a number in there and it's kind of matching RDRS when we're working later, we'll understand what's going on. And with that, I will wrap up this webinar. Thank you so much to Peter and Adriana and RT for fielding the questions and presenting. And I don't think they're answering, but our T folks for getting these reporting changes through on time. This procurement page was a lot harder than you would think it was, and we still might be able to get some little tweaks as we get feedback. But yeah, this one was a lot more effort and a lot more work than we thought it was going to be going in. So really appreciate all their work on this. And with that, we will wrap this up and end the webinar, and watch out for an email, hopefully coming soon, saying that this webinar has been posted to our YouTube channel. Thank you for everyone coming, and have a great day. Bye.